Welcome, everyone. I'm Eric Patashnik, professor and director of the MPA Program at the Watson Institute for International Public Affairs at Brown University. On behalf of Wendy Schiller, the chair of Brown's Political Science Department, and myself, I'm pleased to welcome you to today's panel. We'll be featuring authors of 5 of the chapters from Wendy's and my new edited volume, Dynamics of American Democracy, Partisan Polarization, Political Competition, and Government Performance from University Press of Kansas. The volume examines and illuminates the larger challenges facing American democracy today and brings together leading scholars who study American politics from a broad range of theoretical and methodological perspectives. Overall, the volume examines how partisan polarization and changes in American identity are shaping political behavior, policymaking, and the performance of key institutions such as Congress, the executive, federalism, and the party system. Let me say a brief word about the format for today's panel. We'll hear remarks from each of the 5 distinguished panelists, whom I'll introduce in a moment. And then Wendy and I will then ask the first set of questions, and then we'll open up the discussion to all. We would like to ask those that are registered for the webinar to use the Q&A function to submit your questions. Those who are watching through YouTube can also submit questions. I'd also like to thank Christy Kilgus and the Watson Institute's communication staff for their outstanding support for today's event. So let me now introduce the panelists in the order in which they'll speak. First, Deborah Schildkraut, professor and chair of political science at Tufts University. Her books include Americanism in the 21st Century, Public Opinion in the Age of Immigration. She will be speaking about her chapter on Change and Retreat, Asymmetric Patterns of Political Engagement among Liberals and Conservatives. Next, John Sides, William R. Kennan Jr. Professor of Political Science at Vanderbilt University. His books include Identity Crisis, the 2016 Presidential Campaign, and the Battle for the Meaning of America. He will be speaking on his chapter entitled Gender Attitudes and American Public Opinion in the Trump Era. Next, Sarah Binder, Professor of Political Science at George Washington University and Senior Fellow of Governance Studies at the Brookings Institution. Her books include The Myth of Independence, How Congress Governs the Federal Reserve. And she will be speaking about legislative stalemate in post-war America. Next, Sid Milkis, the White Burkett Miller Professor of Governance and Foreign Affairs at the University of Virginia. His books include Rivalry and Reform, Presidents, Social Movements, and the Transformation of American Politics. He will be speaking today about his chapter, Our Undivided Support, Donald Trump, the Republican Party, and Executive-Centered Partisanship. And finally, Jim Morone, John Hazen White Professor of Political Science and Public Policy at Brown University. His books include Republic of Wrath, How American Politics Turned Tribal from George Washington to Donald Trump. And he will be speaking about his chapter on the rise of tribal politics and historical perspective. So thank you so much to everyone for joining us today. Wendy will be speaking later on in the panel, and we really look forward to a great conversation. And to begin, we will now turn to Deborah.
Hi, thank you so much. Thank you to Eric and Wendy for inviting me to be part of this event today and including me in the book itself. I'd also like to thank the Watson Institute staff for making this happen. And to all of you for taking the time to register and listen in and ask us questions about the things that we have to say today. I'm going to go ahead and share my slides, and I hope that the organizers will let me know if that didn't go smoothly for any reason. So, and I'd also like to acknowledge my co-authors on this chapter, Jeff Berry and Jim Glazer. Okay, so the title of our chapter is Charge and Retreat, Asymmetric Patterns of Political Engagement Among Liberals and Conservatives. And the motivation for this work was thinking about the ideal of deliberation in a democratic society, that you need people from different perspectives and different interests to be able to find a way to communicate with one another. And it was our sense that both sides of the ideological spectrum might be falling short of this ideal, but in different ways. And so part of this chapter is really just descriptive, trying to document if that's the case. And then we try to think about some of the implications for that and how that might be exhibited in patterns of what they contribute to public discourse. And then I'll end talking about some additional research we've done that's trying to look at why we might see the differences that we see. So first, I'll start off with an anecdote that we opened up the chapter with. Not too long ago, there was a story that got a lot of attention for a few days where Alan Dershowitz was remarking that he wasn't invited to social engagements in Martha's Vineyard anymore. And it was because of comments he had made in support of Donald Trump. And this was illustrative, we thought, of the concept of retreat on the side on the left, the idea that liberals might be less likely than conservatives to engage with people who disagree with them. And so hearing someone like Dershowitz support Donald Trump, liberals would then shun him socially. And so this is an example of the phenomenon we want to investigate. So we started off simply by looking at available public opinion surveys that look at self-reports of political engagement, both online and offline. And so here we have some survey questions, and we list the source that it came from, and you can see it spans different years. We have data from the Obama administration, data from the Trump years. And so questions about most of these questions, the first one is a rare exception. Most of the other questions show that liberals are far more likely to disengage with the other side. So do most of my friends share my views? Liberals are much more likely to say yes. A lot of my friends share my political party. We see that liberals are 10 points more likely to do that. Here are more questions documenting this difference. People were asked if they've ever stopped talking to or been friends with someone because of government and politics, and we see a difference between liberals and conservatives, spending less time with family members because of politics. Looking at social media questions, have you ever hidden, blocked, or defriended someone on social media because of politics? Liberals were more likely. We see big differences here, changing people's settings to see fewer posts from people because of politics, or hidden or blocked, again, defriended someone because of politics. And you see this consistent pattern of liberals being more likely to report doing these things than conservatives. And then we found these interesting questions from Pew that also ask people how they feel about political disagreement. So the first one here says political disagreements on social media are more interesting and informative, and conservatives were more likely to say that they find them interesting and informative. Whereas liberals were more likely to conservatives to say that political disagreements are stressful and frustrating. So with these self-reports, we wanted to see if there's a way we could document actual political engagement and see if the differences we see map some of these self-reports. So we turned to Twitter. In the chapter, we spent some time talking about the pros and cons of using Twitter and the challenges of analyzing Twitter. And I will say this was definitely a learning experience for all of us. This was the first time any of us had done any social media analysis. And thank the heavens for our wonderful research assistants, in particular, Alexis Totore, who helped us tremendously in figuring out how to gather and analyze the data that we wanted to do for this. So the first thing that we did, and the challenges of Zoom, I'm in my office and the lights go off when I don't move. So I just have to wave my hands to make my lights go back on. So I'm not sitting here in the dark. Okay, so the first thing that we did was to see if the networks, the follower networks of prominent political elites differ depending on if they're liberal or conservative. And so here, what I have up here, some of the hypotheses we were investigating. And the first one is that conservative Twitter networks will be more ideologically heterogeneous than liberals' Twitter networks. So by this, we mean that if someone is conservative, say Sean Hannity, for example, if we're right that liberals are more likely to withdraw from engagement with the other side, then Sean Hannity's followers should be more likely to be relatively homogeneous. He's only going to get conservative followers. But someone like Rachel Maddow might get liberal followers, and she also might get conservative followers. So her social network, her network of followers may be more ideologically diverse. So we had to figure out a way to try to test this. And then we also thought, if we're right that conservatives find political disagreement more enticing, they may be interested in kind of riling up the other side. This enjoyment of political disagreement might come out in, for example, their tweets being a little more uncivil than liberals active on Twitter. They might engage in more name calling, and we might see conservatives more likely than liberals to talk about, being blocked or muted or unfollowed by people on the other side. So this is what we were trying to investigate. So for the first hypothesis, what we did was, and I'll walk through these graphs, but what we basically did is we came up with a list of 26 elite accounts that involved politicians and involved pundits. So we had something like Mitch McConnell, and we also had Sean Hannity. And I believe we had Joe Biden, and we also had Rachel Maddow. And we used some publicly available tools developed by scholars at NYU to estimate the ideology of a Twitter user. So we randomly sampled followers from each of these 26 accounts, 13 of them liberal, 13 of them conservative, and estimated the ideology of their followers. And we found evidence consistent with these self-reports that we see on surveys. The top graph is looking at conservative elites. So it's looking at 13 elite accounts, looking at around 2,000 followers from each account. And a higher score on this ideology estimator indicates a likelihood that the Twitter follower is conservative. And you can see that, it leans heavily in the conservative side, whereas the bottom graph that shows liberals, is more diverse. It has kind of a bump on the conservative side and a lot on the liberal side. And I can already see that I'm running out of time. So I'm going to go through and just let you know that what we found. So we found support for this hypothesis. We did not find high levels of toxicity in the tweets from followers. What we did was we selected on certain political keywords and randomly selected tweets over 2 years in the Obama administration and 2 years in the Trump administration. Overall, the overall level of toxicity, which was evaluated using a tool developed by Google to estimate the toxicity of tweets, is overall pretty low. And that supports a lot of other research that's being done, that a lot of people on Twitter that are tweeting about news are often just retweeting news headlines. But when they actually are commenting, you can see we break down the ideology of Twitter, the Twitter users, and there isn't that much difference actually between liberals and conservatives on Twitter, and the overall level is pretty low. So that was a bright spot that we weren't expecting to find. I have some examples up here, and there are more in the book, just to validate these online tools, that if you go through and actually look at some of the tweets that are deemed high in toxicity, they actually are pretty toxic and uncivil. So the first one has a toxicity score of 0.97. The scale runs from 0 to 1. So this was rated a very toxic tweet, and you can see by all the asterisks that there's some profanity there. The one below it was rated only 0.06, so not very toxic at all. And I just want to go through and end on this last slide. This slide actually isn't in the book, but it's in some follow-up research that we're doing, where we were wondering if part of the reason why conservatives seem to be more willing to engage with the other side might be because of the phenomenon that a lot of people consider themselves conservative, but don't necessarily have a lot of conservative policy preferences. So that's called the difference between their symbolic ideology, how they view themselves, and their operational ideology, which is how they actually feel about policy issues. So what we did in this graph, this comes from the 2018 Cooperative Congressional Election Study. We look at we replicated some of the questions from the Pew surveys, and we break it down by whether someone identifies as liberal, whether someone identifies as conservative. Those are the first two sets of bars in each cluster. But then the last two sets of bars break conservatives down by whether they're what we call consistent conservatives or inconsistent conservatives. Consistent conservatives are ones who call themselves conservative and also have conservative policy preferences. Whereas inconsistent conservatives are ones who call themselves conservative, but their policy preferences are actually moderate or liberal. So if you just eyeball this graph, I know there's a lot going on here, but if you eyeball this graph, if you look at the lightest shaded gray bar and the darkest shaded gray bar, you'll see that those are pretty similar, and those compare liberals with consistent conservatives. So what we're concluding so far is that part of the reason, not all of it, but part of the reason why we see this inconsistency in engagement between liberals and conservatives might be because a lot of conservatives may not actually be all that conservative in their policy preferences, and so they don't find engagement with the other side all that threatening. So that was a lot that I threw at you in a very short period of time, but my time is up, and so I'm happy to yield the floor to whoever's next, and thank you so much for your attention.
Great. John Sides is our next speaker.
Good afternoon to all of you, coming to you from Nashville, Tennessee. My lights are not at risk of going off, but the dog that should be sleeping next to me but isn't quite sleepy yet could make herself audible here in the next few minutes, and apologies if she does that. You saw that one of the subtitles of the book is Partisan Polarization. And the chapter that I co-authored with Lynn Vavrick and Michael Tesler explores polarization through the lens of gender and gender attitudes. And in particular, we're interested in a set of beliefs that Americans have about the extent to which women face discrimination and harassment. And we're interested in the role that those kinds of sentiments play in helping us understand people's political choices and ultimately the nature of the Democratic and Republican Party coalitions. You will no doubt remember a time in 2015 and 2016 where these issues reached kind of a new height in American politics because of the candidacy of Donald Trump and the candidacy of Hillary Clinton. With Trump in the race, we were, of course, reminded of a number of his previous words and deeds, which were dismissive of, crude, in some sense, insults of women, most famously in the Access Hollywood tape. And with Clinton, of course, her singular candidacy as the first major party female nominee. And what we're interested in doing in this chapter is not just sort of reviewing the way in which gender attitudes mattered in that election, which we talk a little bit about in our book, Identity Crisis, which is a bigger study of that election, but we're interested in tracing it forward through the early years of Trump's presidency. And in a nutshell, what we're arguing in this chapter is that gender attitudes are increasingly an important ingredient in people's political choices and an important differentiation between the views of Democrats and Republicans in the mass public. So let me just say a little bit about how we make that case. We start with the 2016 presidential election. And what we're doing here is we're looking at the extent to which people's attitudes about sexual harassment, discrimination, and things like that are related to how they voted. And is that different than in previous elections? Are these attitudes just something that kind of matters a lot in lots of different elections, or was there a distinctive role for these attitudes in 2016? And so we measure these kinds of attitudes by asking people whether they agree or disagree with questions like, women who complain about harassment cause more problems than they solve. And so, you ask people several questions in this vein, and what you're getting is the extent to which they think that problems like gender discrimination and harassment are, in some sense, real issues, or whether or not they reflect just women complaining about nothing or looking for special favors or things of that sort. And in the book, we showed that in 2016, among both women and men, these attitudes were more strongly predictive of how you voted in terms of Trump versus Clinton than they had been in the previous presidential election, where you had, of course, Romney against Barack Obama. And in particular, the useful thing about these attitudes is it's showing us how the American public is not just divided based on gender, men and women, but each gender is divided internally based on its own gender attitudes, such that women who have more a view of issues like discrimination and harassment that suggests it's not a big problem, they are also more likely to vote for Trump than women who do think that those things are big problems. Now, an interesting question, though, is does this continue in the Trump presidency? And obviously, you all will remember that in 2017, we had another way in which these issues were brought to the fore of American politics and society, and that was the Me Too movement. In particular, the accusations by numerous women against the movie producer Harvey Weinstein, and then a series of other public figures who experienced, basically a downfall or finally some degree of cost for their previous behavior. Our argument is that those events, along with Trump's reaction to those events, right, makes people's gender attitudes continue to be important. You all will remember, for example, that at the height of the Me Too accusations, when Trump was asked about these things, he said, it's a very scary time for young men in America when you can be guilty of something that you may not be guilty of. And then asked, well, what do you think, what would you say to young women? He says, women are doing great. So very early on in the Me Too movement, there was a very sharp partisan distinction between how Democrats and Republicans viewed that movement, which reflected messages from leaders like Trump as opposed to messages from leaders like in the Democratic Party. So what's happened over time in views of Trump and in how the parties themselves are composed is that there's an increasing role of these gender attitudes. And the thing that makes it particularly troubling, I think, for scholars and observers and citizens in the United States is that these differences appear to be increasingly not just about Trump, but about just Democrats and Republicans generally. So one of the last things we can show in the book is that there is an increasing difference between Democrats and Republicans in their answers to things like, how favorably do you feel about feminists? Do you think women are likely to face discrimination? You know, when women demand equality these days, they're actually seeking special favors. Democrats and Republicans were divided on those things, at least somewhat, in the earliest surveys that we have from 2012, but there's even more divided as of 2018. And so this suggests a particularly challenging prospect for American politics, which is that even after the Trump presidency, we're going to continue to have partisan conflict oriented around fundamental disagreements, not just about racial identities or ethnic identities, but fundamental disagreements about the experiences of women, and in particular, the importance of gender discrimination and gender harassment in American politics. Thank you very much. Be happy to talk more about this in Q&A.
Great. Thanks, John. Our next speaker is Sarah Binder.
Excellent. Let me set the timer and then share my slides here. Give me 1 second. Okay. Give me 1 second. Okay, slides good to go here? Assume. Okay, let me just, okay. Well, thanks very much for including me in the volume and today. My chapter today tackles the dynamics of legislative stalemate over the long post-war period, the 7 decades that run from 1947 through the end of Trump's first Congress in 2018. So I'm going to offer 3 takeaways. I'm going to summarize them quickly and then come back in more detail to each of them. So first takeaway, to truly understand the dynamics of today's legislative stalemate in Congress, it's important to take a long historical perspective. Second, unified party control of Congress and the White House, it once made a sizable difference in shaping Congress's capacity to solve problems, but today, unified party control has lost a lot of its firepower, and it has encouraged majorities to bend rules and norms to short circuit legislative hurdles. Third, as always, measurement matters. How we measure legislative stalemate and performance has implications for what we conclude about Congress's problem-solving capacity. So a little bit of detail on each of these 3 points. First, the importance of historical perspective. As I detail in the chapter, I have spent the last 25 years, a whole quarter century, developing, maintaining, and now updating a systematic measure of Congress's performance. And as I'll show in a second, the measure assesses the frequency of deadlock on the big ticket items on Congress's and the nation's agenda. Now, most measures of legislative performance count up the number of big laws enacted each Congress. My measure instead offers both a numerator as well as denominator. The denominator, as I'll argue today, is pretty important. It tells us in this case about the number and the identity of policy problems on the agenda, which I draw daily from the editorial page of the New York Times, whether it's issues that the Times wants to see enacted or issues they think are wrong. So we can get a glimpse of what a denominator here looks like. These, again, are by Congress, applying what I call a salience filter. What are the big ticket items? How many big ticket items are on the agenda each Congress? And just with the smoother there on the chart, you can see that over that long 70-year period, the number of big issues arising in Washington and around the country has certainly and steadily gone up. Now, the numerator of those issues, what percent stalemated? How many issues did Congress fail to address with a legislative solution? So we can put that all together to give what I call this measure of legislative stalemate, the percentage of big issues deadlocked each Congress over time. So to the first of my points, the importance of thinking in a historical perspective here, what do we learn from the long run here? Well, first, we often say that today's Congresses are the worst ever. But I would encourage us first, don't forget the late 1990s here when the Republican Congress faced off against Democrat Bill Clinton. Levels of deadlock by my measure, which are similar to what we see today. And in fact, this is precisely the period when I first started the project in reaction to the levels of deadlock in Washington. But second, regardless of that 1990s period, there is a secular rise here in legislative deadlock. Variation over time, but deadlock today is greater than it was some 40, 50, 60 plus years ago. So the first takeaway, it's important to keep that historical arc in mind. It helps us to make better assessments of today's congressional capacity. Second takeaway is really about the impact of unified party control on congressional deadlock. And the data here, I think, are helpful for making sense of whether or not unified party control has some extra firepower to help Congress and the president legislate. When I first published work from this project in early 2000, from 47 through 2000, over that period, unified party control made a difference. Congress systematically did more in periods and addressed a greater proportion of the big issues when Congress was unified compared to divided. 2 decades later, when I go all the way through 2018, unified party control is no longer a silver bullet. As others have joined me in arguing over these long years, the most robust factor complicating Congress's ability to legislate, even in periods of unified party control, is the rise of legislative polarization. What do we mean by polarization? Well, it could be ideological. The parties just disagree about the role of government. It could just be partisanship. My team's for it, so your team is against it. It could be electoral competition, right? Tight party control has, contest for electoral control has increased over the same period, decreasing the incentive to cooperate with the other party. It's very hard to parse these separate dimensions, but collectively they add up to an increased incentive to disagree first about what is a problem, what isn't a problem, and an increased incentive just to say no to the other party to go into the bargaining table. Now, just quickly, in another chapter in the book, Frances Lee raises an important point. She says, don't overstate the importance of polarization. She points us to internal disagreements within the party, particularly the Republican Party in the last 2 to 4 years. I agree, these cleavages matter, but I would also remind us that the differences within the parties pale in comparison to the differences between the parties. So the larger question, why has polarization or partisanship increased deadlock and thus wiped out the effect of unified party control? Well, polarization increases the incentive for the opposition in both chambers, but especially the Senate, to exploit the rules of the game to block the majority party. Add in that we're in a period of particularly slim majorities, and there's very little incentive and difficulty for the majority party to deliver when the opposition won't cooperate. So again, the long view matters here. Our party system and party dynamics have changed over that time, undermining the firepower of unified party control. Finally, the third point about measurement. I can't say it enough times. Numerators aren't enough. We need a denominator to benchmark Congress's performance. Simply pointing out that Congress does still achieve landmark bipartisan accomplishments, which they do. But I don't think that's enough to debunk the broader story about rising congressional dysfunction. So I will just wrap up here with a story that appeared in the New York Times conveniently yesterday about retiring Senators Tom Udall, Lamar Alexander. And Lamar Alexander says, I'll just read very quickly here. He said he believed the Senate was a victim of today's internet democracy, where the fire and immediacy of partisan combat draws all the attention, and whatever legislation is moving along is pushed into the background in the split screen Capitol. On one side are tweets and confirmation hearings, but on the other side are the Great American Outdoors Act and the 21st Century Cures Act. What's the argument? Congress is productive, but we're not paying attention to the real episodes of congressional problem solving. I agree, we should not overestimate dysfunction. Congress does still sometimes solve big problems, but I don't find any evidence that the most salient issues are those more likely to end up in gridlock. We can test that, and there's very little evidence of that. But it's also the case that telling us what Congress accomplished ignores the denominator. Immigration reform, climate change, entitlement reform, gun regulation, healthcare, dozens of issues on the agenda that just don't make it past the finish line. And oftentimes leaders don't even open the gates. And on that bright note, and I don't know anything else about horse racing, I'm going to stop right there.
Great. Thank you so much, Sarah. Our next speaker is Sid Milkis.
No, thank you, Eric. It's an honor to be here, an honor to be in the volume. I want to acknowledge my co-author on this chapter, Nick Jacobs, who's at Colby College. Now, most directly, our chapter asks how, in less than 4 years, the Republican Party has become the Trump Party. And we examine Republican strong support for Trump's America First program, much of which has been carried out with audacious executive action. And we look at he and his political allies' systematic capture, and I mean systematic capture, of the national, state, and local Republican organizations, and show just how deeply the Trump brand has been imprinted on the Republican Party. And the denouement of this hostile takeover of the Republican Party came just before the scaled back Republican convention began, when the RNC resolved for the first time in the Republican Party's history, for the first time since their first presidential campaign in 1856, to forego a party platform altogether. Instead, the RNC pledged, and I quote, to enthusiastically support the president's America First agenda. So given this research, Nick and I have not been surprised, even though we've been horrified, that the party elders have been complicit in President Trump's crusade to become the first president to prevent a peaceful transition of power. Now, this startling development is not merely a result of a cult of personality. There are deep historical roots. Of course, there are a lot of features of the Trump presidency that are sui generis, but his partisanship marks the culmination of a century-long development in American politics, the rise of what we call executive-centered partisanship, with Democrats and Republicans alike relying on presidents and presidential candidates to pronounce party doctrine, to raise campaign funds, to campaign on behalf of their partisan brethren, to mobilize grassroots support, and through unilateral action, advance party programs. Now, this executive-centered partisanship sits at the cross currents of two related phenomena in American political development. First, the form of party contestation that allowed Trump to capture the Republican nomination in 2016 and retain the loyalty of his party even in defeat in 2020 is a consequence of organizational and electoral reforms that weakened the decentralized patronage-based parties that dominated most of the 19th century. Throughout the 20th century, both parties were pressured by insurgent movements to alter the rules governing their presidential nomination process, ostensibly to give more power to the people in selecting candidates for office and in determining party priorities. The destination of these efforts was the McGovern-Fraser reforms, which established a system of open primaries and caucuses by the 1972 presidential election. The pursuit of participatory democracy, however, didn't empower the Downsian median voter. Instead, the weakening of traditional party organizations enhanced the influence of donors interest groups, and social media who scorn the pragmatic politics and the compromises that historically have been central to forging majority coalitions. Now, the effect of these reforms to the presidential selection process have been magnified by a second development, the creation of a presidential institution, which was authorized by the 1939 Executive Reorganization Act. Really, this deserves to be called the organic statute of the executive-centered administrative state that was formed during Franklin Roosevelt's long presidency. With the creation of the Executive Office of the President, comprised of the White House Office, the West Wing, and important staff agencies like the Office of Management and Budget, the president could form alliances with activists and outside groups who disdain the party establishment. And this presidency-aligned partisanship eventually subordinated, decentralized, and pluralistic party coalitions to national and programmatic networks that now shape contemporary partisan politics. So in sum, the new style of campaigning gives presidential contenders the authority to command the party. Administrative government gives them the power to advance its causes. Now, these two developments were consolidated during the New Deal, but what Hugh Hecklow calls 60 civics gave rise to a new, more antinomian strain of executive-centered partisanship. The 60s loosed movement politics and a struggle for American identity that reverberates powerfully through our own time. And since then, progressive and conservative movement activists have pulled the parties away from the center. They have energized grassroots bases. They have shattered areas of post-war consensus, and they have fueled ideological polarization and legislative stalemate, which Sarah talked about. Now, as a consequence, presidents of both parties have sought to achieve their policy objectives with unilateral administrative action rather than now navigate a complex system of separated powers to pass legislation. With fractious politics in Congress increasingly creating gridlock, organized interests and movement activists have grown accustomed to executive orders that further their aims. Lyndon Johnson, Richard Nixon, Ronald Reagan, and George W. Bush all contributed to developments that pulled the modern presidency into the vortex of heightened partisanship. But this joining of executive power and social activism and partisan polarization I've been talking about culminated with Barack Obama and Donald Trump. Obama, I think, is a really important precursor to Trump. The election of America's first African-American president aroused the fierce resistance of Republican activists, especially the Christian right and the Tea Party. And these activists found cause in the campaign and government actions of a clever demagogue who practices a form of right-wing populism that threatens to transform Republican conservatism into authoritarian nationalism. But the reaction to Obama is more than symbolic. Obama's politics and his policy sought to summon a widely scattered but potentially powerful coalition. The coalition of the ascendant, as the journalist Ron Brown calls it. It's kind of the maturing of the Great Society. Minorities, the LGBT community, youth, and educated white professionals, especially women. Trump and his strategists positioned him as the steward of a coalition of restoration, comprised of blue-collar, religiously devout, and non-urban whites who believe that their way of life is threatened by cultural developments and demographic changes that played out in the 60s, but seemed to come into full realization with the first African-American president in the White House. This combination of institutional change and charismatic leadership has sent me back to Max Weber's discussion of the charismatic leader. As Max Weber said of the charismatic leader, the Republican Party's devotion to Trump is born of distress and enthusiasm. Now, I see that I'm almost out of time, so let me just make one more point about Trump's presidential leadership. Trump has surpassed Obama by far in attending to his base. He's really the first president to define himself as a movement president. And from the earliest days in office, Trump's efforts to mobilize support for his controversial plans to make America great again have involved unrelenting appeals to core supporters who he calls his loyal customers, with whom he really has forged an atavistic connection. Now, an unmediated connection between the president and his party's base is a hallmark of executive-centered partisanship. But with tweets and mass rallies, Trump has given a new meaning to the permanent campaign. And I think the mass rallies are especially pioneering. These are energizing spectacles that produce an image of the president as the leader of a movement. And this is not just image. I don't have time to go into the details. But this movement leadership has been nurtured by a good deal of partisan policy. With administrative action, Trump has relentlessly pursued America First programs. And it's also been nurtured by institutionalism, particularly by the really systematic effort by the Trump and his political allies, successful effort to take over the party apparatus, including almost all of the state party committees. So to return to Weber, what we might be seeing with the Trump administration is a routinization of charisma. So I agree with John that Trumpism isn't going away. So with that, let me stop. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Sid. And our final speaker today is Jim Morone.
Thank you. And thank you for making me part of this amazing group of political scientists. Thanks to Eric, to Wendy, and to the Watson folks, Christy and Alex, for putting together this show. And thanks to you for coming on. I'm going to try to share my screen. And hopefully this will work. Can you guys, I'm hoping you guys can see a screen show.
Yep.
This chapter of mine takes off from or crystallizes really a book that just came out this fall. And if you can see my screen, you see it pictured there in the upper corner. What I'm going to talk about today, there's the list of things, but I want to start with two truths, two things that really strike you if you spend time looking at the American history of politics and partisanship. And the first, which is a little reassuring after what we've witnessed and lived through in the last 4 years, is that change is really constant in American politics. Don't get used to any truths because they keep evolving. To take just one simple example, if you looked at a electoral map a generation ago, you'd see, for example, Michael Dukakis, when he started to run in 1988, he could be pretty sure that he would win West Virginia, which he did, one of the very few states he won, and pretty sure that he would lose California, which had, after all, gone Republican 8 of the 9 previous presidential elections. Now, today, of course, West Virginia is about as red and California about as blue as you can get. Again, the long view that Sarah was talking about really shows us constant change. Who would have thought 10 years ago that Georgia would go for a Democrat? So as you get depressed about our current situation, just remember about constant change, though, of course, change isn't necessarily towards the more democratic or the better. The second change that really struck me as I looked at our system is how rickety an electoral system we have. The Constitutional Convention wasn't particularly interested in how people voted. They left it to the states, and right from the starts, the states played politics with how we vote. The first election of 1800, the first contested election between two parties, 7 of the 16 states fiddled with the rules in order to help the candidate the majority wanted. It's Jefferson versus Adams. And once all the votes were counted, the losing Federalists tried to grab onto the vice president, Aaron Burr, and co-opt him to their side. It took 35 angry votes in Congress before Thomas Jefferson got his electoral victory. So basic point, which all the electoral rules themselves are repeatedly up for grabs. We're always fiddling. And this is all made much more difficult because of something quite extraordinary. There is no right to vote for president in the Constitution and the Bill of Rights in American politics. The Supreme Court put it bluntly in Bush v. Gore: the individual citizen has no federal constitutional right to vote for electors for the president of the United States. Tripping over the beautiful language there, but it is a stunning reality. Now, the system, the rickety system, the rickety 50 different state system held this time. But as I look over the past and think about the present, there are a lot of reforms we need to make our electoral system more robust in the face of the things that Sid, everybody else, Sarah, John, everybody else was talking about. And I would start with that very dramatic gap, the right to vote. When Congress first proposed the 15th Amendment to let the former slaves vote, a quite radical amendment made its way to the Senate floor. All adult citizens of the United States shall be entitled to an equal vote in all elections. Now, that was way too radical for the period. That would have let Irish people vote in Boston, and who knows, maybe even Chinese in California, so they voted it down. But perhaps we're ready to start fighting for that constitutional amendment today, which gets us to the present day and the extraordinary partisan politics that all the speakers have talked about. Here's one dramatic example. If you can see my slides, Pew does a study every year of different values and what explains how people hold them. And if you can see the slide, nothing explains the values like party. If you tell me your party, I know a lot more about what you believe than your race, your religious attendance, your age, your gender, and all the rest. And on the right side of the screen, how that gets translated into politics. And precisely as Sid just said, in environmental politics, there was a 10-point difference, not insignificant, but not that great gapping, not that great a gap when Obama took office. And that gap now more than 40 points in one policy area, but we see it in policy area after policy area. But it's not just policy, it's not just values, it's a kind of negative fear of the other party. The slurs that people use against one another. Republicans called them Democrats immoral and lazy. Democrats answer back with dishonest and immoral, and both sides agree. The other side is closed-minded. That tweet study really dramatically shows some of this. Lynn Vavreck, the co-author of John Side's paper, had a wonderful little study that showed that today 6 out of 10 parents in a party would be upset or very upset if their children were to marry across the party aisle. Now, there's 2 great developments that are new in our party politics that lead to this intense polarization. Among the things that lead to the intense polarization, one is simply, and it's been mentioned, how close our elections are. Since 2000, we've had 11 changes in House, Senate, or the presidency, no such 20-year period in all of American history. And secondly, for the first time in American history, the tribal differences are mobilized by the party. We could talk about the differences with the past, but for the first time, race the two great cultural battles, three really, race, nativism, and gender, have all mobilized into the same party. It used to be, you could see this racist cartoon from the late 19th century, it used to be that people who supported civil rights were really quite different from the people who supported immigrant rights in terms of their party. But today, all the so-called minorities are on one side. And it took really 90 years to get there, little by little. First African Americans, then immigrants and different immigrant groups, and later women. And through the period, really starting in 1972, the white vote went Republican. You can see it there on the bottom. On average, 39% of the white vote between 1980 and today has been in for the Republican Party. So each part of this coalition of minorities on one side and voters on the other side, speaking about the majority of each group, of course, took a long time to develop. Here's just, I don't have time to go into it, but here's the example of the African American group going from, in three great bursts, into the Democratic Party. And that very first move in 1932, looking really quite a bit like the Latino first stirring towards Republicans in the last election. We could talk much more about how African Americans got into the Democratic Party over the course of the 20th century, how Latinos, Asians, or African Americans did. But for now, let me just end with two assignments. We are, after all, in a virtual classroom. So if I were rule of the world, I'd give each party one assignment. The Republican Party assignment is this: honest conservatives today, particularly young conservatives, have to break the connection that's always existed between one party and white supremacy. And today, it's Republicans who connect honest conservatism with white privilege. And if you're a young conservative out there, your job is to finally break that connection that's been very powerful since 1964, when white supremacists moved from the Democrats finally to the Republicans, though that was a long time coming. And for Democrats, something new has developed since the Obama election. For the first time since 1800, Democrats are no longer the party of the working class, and their assignment is to reconnect with the working class of all races and all groups, or they'll be very, very sorry to have lost that legacy. Finally, I just say, once again, thank you to our organizers, and I look forward to your questions. Thanks very much, and let me see if I can stop sharing the screen.
Great. Thanks so much, Jim. So for the next segment of the discussion, Wendy and I will do a quick round robin of questions with the panelists. In the meantime, I would encourage members of the audience to start submitting your questions into the Q&A box, and then we'll begin selecting some of those. So I have a question for Deborah to begin. Deborah's chapter is, I think, just terrific, full of really interesting and unexpected findings, and really encourage you to pick up the book and read all the great chapters. But this is one that really has a lot of fresh empirical findings. So one of them is that the study challenges the conventional wisdom that conservatives live in a Fox media bubble and are sealed off from reality. And so I wondered if you could, for a moment, speculate a little bit about the broader implications of your finding. For example, should we perhaps be less worried about surveys showing that most Republicans think that Trump won the election, and more inclined to think, for example, that maybe those surveys are just showing tapping into partisan cheerleading, and that they actually aren't sealed off from the reality of who won the election?
Yeah, so the study of what you just described is expressive responding, where you kind of know what the right answer is, but you say the answer that feels good to say on something like who actually won the election. And my understanding, so I haven't studied expressive responding myself. My understanding is that among the people who are studying, they themselves don't really agree which one is more prevalent. It's a fairly new area to study, and figuring out the best way to actually determine what's a genuine preference versus, or what's a genuine belief in fact versus what just feels good to say, is going on. I do know there are studies of political knowledge where they, offer to pay people for every correct answer, and you find that things like expressive responding goes way down in that type of studies. So that makes me think there is a fair bit of expressive responding going out there, that people are giving the answer that feels good and that's kind of cheering for their side. Sarah Binder talked about that a little bit as one of the factors that contributes to the inability to make progress is the team cheerleading and refusal to cede anything to your side. But yeah, so I think that's part of it, is on those types of questions, is the expressive responding. But I also think this idea that I talked about at the very end, that we have to, when we think about ideology, that really separating out what people call themselves versus what their policy preferences are. And I think another promising way that you could examine the data, and I've seen some of this in, I think, a Pew report recently, is rather than looking at by who has conservative preferences and who doesn't, but who watches Fox News and who doesn't. So within Republicans or within self-identified conservatives, you can separate out which ones are routine Fox News watchers or sole Fox News watchers. Because that's the other thing, is that even though there are lots of Republicans and conservatives who watch Fox News, a lot of survey data reveals that Americans are actually getting their news from a wide variety of sources, and they may have a primary source or a source they trust the most. I think it's overblown how much people are getting their news from just one place. So breaking it out that way could also be another way that you could see that it's not as much of a monolithic divide as it first appeared to us when we looked at conservatives versus liberals, and that when you break it down by their policy preferences, you see that those who hold their policy preferences most dearly or consistently with their self-identified ideology are also averse to engaging with the other side.
Great. Wendy?
Thanks. I have a question for John Sides and the John Sides, Lynn Vavrick, and Michael Tesler team. John, you mentioned, I think really strikingly in your talk, maybe you could elaborate a little bit on this finding, which was that even women who had had ideas about discrimination against women, about bad language towards women, harassment, and this sort of denigration of women, still voted for Trump or liked Trump or wanted to vote Republican. And I wonder if you could associate that with education, because we saw in this election in 2020, we have the first African-American South Asian vice president, female vice president, but also the GOP made significant gains in the House, selecting a range of women to House seats. So could you talk a little bit about that interaction between education and attitudes on gender, particularly among women? And then how do we use that information to sort of make sense of 2020?
Yeah, it's a great question. In general, when social scientists look at attitudes towards a range of groups that have experienced discrimination, harassment, marginalization, better educated people are more likely to express sympathy for those groups. African Americans is another example. So there is one of the things that correlates with your views on these questions about sexual harassment and discrimination is the level of formal education that you have. So I tend to think of an issue like gender as, in some sense, one of the ingredients that has helped to create, a larger diploma divide, as it's sometimes called, between the two parties. And that's going to be present among both women and men. The gender gap between men and women in terms of their partisanship is real, but it's oftentimes dwarfed by the size of the differences among women or the differences among men in terms of their political attitudes, such as with regard to sexual harassment. So I think there's a couple of implications then, taking the story through, to this election. I don't have, any 2020 data to report on yet, but all of the data that we've seen thus far suggests that many of the partisan divisions that were sharpened in 2016 and then in 2018 that we document in our chapter have likely only become more so. The initial data, for example, appears to suggest, a continued migration of a certain kind of more educated white voter away from Trump, away from the Republican Party. That's only going to sharpen these distinctions. I I do think that you mentioned the ability of Republicans to elect more women to Congress this year. One of the things we talk about in the chapter in 2018, of course, was that it was a year in which Democratic women appeared to be particularly mobilized. And the fact that the Republican Party was able to sort of engender a very modest level of mobilization itself, candidate recruitment and mobilization itself, I mean, it just goes to suggest, right, that again, simple demographic categories like gender aren't going to give us as much purchase on things from not just who the party is in terms of voters, but who the party is in terms of politicians. And to me, that's also, of course, reflected in the fact that Republicans seem to have done better with some African-American voters in 2020, as well as with Latino voters in a number of communities. The sort of the simple demographic groups that we oftentimes think about in terms of, sex and race and ethnicity and things like that only get us so far. And this is why our chapter is so focused on gender attitudes above and beyond gender.
Great, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, I get the next question for Sarah Binder. Okay, great. So I actually had a question related to something you said in your presentation. You said differences within the parties pale in comparison to differences between the parties in terms of accounting for or being a source of explanation for gridlock. So what I want to know from you, if you could dare to speculate, is what effects do you expect to see from division within the two major parties on congressional productivity in the 117th Congress? We have a very narrow House majority on the Democratic side. We don't know the majority in the Senate, but it will be narrow for whichever party has it. And how does Trump's after presidency presence affect that dynamic?
So that's a great and hard question. Thank you very much. So I think you put your fingers on in part the difficulties both for party leaders here, as well as for us trying to answer the question, just the extraordinarily slim majority, right? It is the smallest Democratic majorities in the House have been, I think, since the 19th century. We've had about 20 years ago, we've had Republican majorities this small, but Democrats are not used to trying to legislate. And that difficulty will be amplified by what appear to be divisions between, let's call them the progressives and those in the swing states, swing districts. In the past couple of years, I think Pelosi, she calls the swing district Democrats, right? She calls them the majority makers, right? The only way for Democrats to hold a majority is to win on purple turf. And that problem doesn't go away in a period of slim majorities, regardless of unified or divided control. So one view is that these internal divides will make the House ungovernable. But I think that probably exaggerates the differences, those cleavages within the Democratic Party. And the other element here is you have Biden as president, who certainly doesn't share all that many sympathies and policy inclinations as the progressives will want to bring to the table. So does it matter if the Democrats gain the Senate? Well, if they gain the Senate, there will be increased pressure on the left flank of the Democrats to come to the table and to find what they can agree on for sure. And I think that will probably diminish their power. But I think it's a little hard to know, especially if there's split party control. There'll be so many forces leading to disagreement. I think it's going to reduce the pressure on the progressives to get into line because there are other forces that are going to stop the Democrats from going forward. But I think one thing to come back to the Trump question, but the one thing to keep in mind here, and we see it potentially already, that with Biden and Democrats' impending control of the White House, Nancy Pelosi's no longer top fiddle, top dog, right? You've seen her very carefully step back to say, okay, no more $2 trillion COVID relief. Because I think Biden says, look, I need anything you can get. This isn't a blame game anymore. This is a matter of getting some relief so that the hole I dig us out of isn't so deep. So I think that's going to be a little different dynamic than certainly we're used to during the Trump years. The Trump overhang, That is anybody's guess here, whether this is, he stages his departure show, and do we stop paying attention to him? I think that's easier for Democrats to say. I think for Republicans, for now, he remains the main show. And that's going to have a stranglehold on Republicans, at least in the short term. Unless legal difficulties, financial difficulties make it harder for him to keep putting on the show. But I think it's yet another ingredient to the difficulties of trying to get everybody to the bargaining table over these big issues.
Thank you very much. Sid Milkis, I get one question for you, and then we turn it back to Eric. Joe Biden is a consummate legislative deal maker, but he'll face great pressure to make aggressive use of his executive powers to advance Democratic Party goals. Given this reality, is there anything Biden can do to take the edge off executive-centered partisanship during his administration?
Yeah, it's an important question to contemplate. One thing about Biden is he's not charismatic, and he has a more inclusive style. So there is the potential for him both to try to revitalize collective partisan responsibility, move a little bit of authority, power away from the defining role that the presidency has played. And Wendy, he really began to do that soon after winning the nomination, when he called all the leading stakeholders, including those representatives of the progressive wing of the party, to put together a plan of action and a platform. And the Democratic platform really is a embodiment of the diversity of the Democratic coalition. That said, given, I agree with everything Sarah has just said, given that the Congress is so evenly divided, given that Trump is kind of playing the 1918 card that Mussolini and Hitler played. I'm not saying he's one of them, but this argument that we got stabbed in the back is a very powerful one for a charismatic leader who's taken over the apparatus of the Republican Party. So with the closeness of the Congress, with the Trump overhang, there's going to be tremendous pressure on Biden to take action very quickly, administratively, to show that there's going to be a dramatic trajectory away from the Trump presidency. He has already acknowledged this and plans and is planning a flurry of administrative actions early in his presidency on things stemming from climate change to student loans. Trump has left a loaded administrative weapon on the desk of the Oval Office. If Trump can declare an emergency to build a wall with money that he's not appropriated, why can't Biden declare a climate change emergency? Why can't he declare an emergency to deal with the economic crisis that COVID has caused and provide rent and mortgage relief? So I think there's a potential to move away from this executive-centered partisanship in a way that we haven't seen in a long time, and I think Biden's an important part of that. But I think this executive-centered partisanship is so deeply embedded in the political system, in American democracy, that it's I'm cautiously optimistic, but I put the emphasis on cautious.
Thank you. I'll turn the MC responsibilities back over to Eric Patashnik.
Great. So I'll ask a question of Jim Morone, and then we'll turn to questions from the audience, and Wendy will pick the first one. So if you'd like to submit, please do. So my question for Jim is, I want to begin where you ended, with this key challenge for the Democratic Party to confront inequality and defend the interests of the common people against money power. In light of what John Sides mentioned, the growing diploma divide, which is really striking, which was evident in the 2020 elections, what concrete steps can Democrats take to become a more populist party on economic issues that doesn't alienate working class people of all races and backgrounds who lack college degrees. Clearly, it's going to be difficult to be an egalitarian party if you're only the party or seen as the party of well-educated voters. What can the Democrats do?
Yes, and that's really striking. I mean, I think it's the 2010 when the working class and poor people flipped for the very first time from the various kinds of Democratic Party to the Republican Party. The other thing, step back and look at American politics since 1970. If you were to look at the measures of inequality in 1970, you would find that the United States, this is something named after an Italian economist named the Gini Index, you would find that the United States fit snugly between Japan and France, with a Gini Index that really was very much part of the European consensus that in the 50 years since 1970, no country, Great Britain aside, and it's a special case, has seen inequality rise as intensely as the United States has. We're much closer now to the South American League, to Mexico and Brazil, as the European countries and Japan have left us in the dust in terms of inequality. So there's something very real underneath this sort of anger of poor working class Americans. And that's a level of inequality that really shows a country where people who are good at symbolic manipulation, that is everybody listening to this show, to people with college degrees, have done on average quite well. And people who aren't, who are not good at school, have done really quite badly. So I think it's not better messaging or some or something like that. It really goes down to becoming a party who can convince not only itself, but the rest of the United States that it has a plan for beginning to roll back this kind of inequality. And given all the things we've just heard Sarah and John and Sid say about where we are for the next 4 years, it's just hard to imagine how that would be. This is not a project for a year or 2 years or 4 years. It's a real intellectual project as to how you roll back a intense inequality, noting that most countries, almost all countries, almost all rich countries have done far, far better than we have. I'll just say one more thing, and that is the Democratic Party, I think, became the poster child of the Rust Belt with the NAFTA agreement, where its own labor wing did battle with the Clintons over international trade agreements. And to this day, when reporters go out and talk to people in the countryside, NAFTA is still cited. Labor still, for all the things the Republican Party have done to it, that was the great poster child that I believe led the Democrats into that cul-de-sac. If I could just say one more quick thing, and that is to weigh in on this whole question of presidential politics. Our comparative colleagues often note that presidential systems are inherently unstable because they eventually lead to gridlock. And that leads to powerful presidencies. It's happened in almost all countries in South America. And now they say it's come home to roost in the United States. The problem may just be deeper than anything we've talked about today and built into our constitutional system. We were lucky for a whole series of reasons to avoid it in the past, but many comparativists would shake their heads and say, now you're suffering the problems inherent in your system, and that is presidential power. Something, by the way, Tocqueville had predicted in 1931.
Thanks, Jim. So turn it back to Wendy to pick an audience question.
So I'll start with, there's two related questions. So some of them are related to each other. So the first question is for Deb Schildkraut, which is, in your data, you have patterns of interaction within conservative groups and liberal groups. And this question is, you know, it seems as though conservatives are less likely to engage in a vitriolic way. Is it the case that their interactions are more limited? Are they only really talking, in terms of Twitter or following people who agree with them or are conservatives? That's one question. And then to John Side's work, it's a little bit related, which is the idea of the sort of characteristic determining your choices, of the attitudes, when you did the attitudes towards gender, not just gender, but attitude toward gender. Is there some difference between older individuals and middle-aged and younger individuals? So the first question for Deb, and then the follow-up to John Sides.
Yeah, so the data that I've seen, I don't really see evidence that conservatives are not interacting with, that they're interacting with a smaller number of people. One thing that's been really striking to me is the consistency across self-reports over time, regardless of who's president over the years, this divide with conservatives being much less likely to say they've blocked someone because of politics, they've stopped seeing someone or stopped talking to a family member. So all this suggests that they're doing more engaging with more people who are different from them. And that's just really a consistent finding. And so one thing that was motivating our study was the idea, well, maybe they kind of relish the conflict in a way that liberals don't. And that's where we tend to, so far, we haven't been really finding the evidence of that so much. It seems to be more of the ideological or the policy heterogeneity within conservatives more than anything else. Another area we're thinking of looking at is the emotional responses that people feel to conflict. We have some survey data that suggests liberals are more likely to report feeling anxious and worried and upset when they engage in political disagreements, and conservatives are more likely to say they feel fine. Like, it's not so much that they relish it, but that they're just kind of a lack of being bothered by it. And so that's one avenue we're pursuing. And then another is there's a new study recently came out by Emily Seid-Snyder. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing her name correctly. She has developed a measure of kind of conflict aversion related specifically to politics. And so we're interested in also pursuing, again, that's another way of looking at the same kind of emotional reaction I just mentioned, that maybe there's just a different comfort level with the idea of conflict that might be doing some of that, because we close the gap a little bit when we look at when we look at policy preferences among conservatives, but we don't make the gap between liberals and conservatives completely go away. And one last thing is that in the last graph that I had up, I was comparing liberals to what we called consistent conservatives, people who consider themselves conservative and also have conservative policy preferences. And one thing I forgot to say was that we didn't have a similar breakdown of liberals by whether liberals are consistent or inconsistent. And the reason is because liberals are far more likely to be consistent. This is true in some of the original research that distinguished between operational ideology and symbolic ideology. And it was true in our 2018 data as well. Nearly everybody who identified as liberal also gave the liberal response to policy questions, and there was much more variation among conservatives, people who considered themselves conservative. A lot of them gave moderate or liberal policy preferences, not conservative ones.
Okay, thank you very much. And John Sides, can you tell us a little bit about the age distribution in your data?
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you to Deb for answering that question with enough time to allow me to actually pull up some data and take a really specific look at this to make sure that I got it right. So yeah, I think the distribution here of these kinds of sentiments about gender discrimination and harassment, they're related to age in pretty much the way that you would expect. People who strongly disagree with this question that asks you whether, women who complain about harassment often cause more problems than they solve. So if you disagree with that, you're saying, no, wait, that's not right. Women who complain about harassment aren't causing problems, they're revealing problems. And so that sentiment is just much more common among people who are, let's say, 18 to 29 relative to these older groups. And as you go from sort of this is a crude way to do it, but you go from 18 to 29, 30 to 44, 45 to 64, 65 plus, which is one common way we break down age groups. Among every group, that sentiment shrinks as you get older and older and older. I think the biggest difference in our data is between the youngest people and everyone else. So there are differences between the middle groups and the oldest group, for example, but it's that youngest group that looks distinctively, I think, progressive on this particular question. So again, I think with with a lot of these topics that are basically, you could sort of group under the label civil rights. Whether we're talking about civil rights for gays and lesbians, we're talking about it for racial minorities, we're talking about women. All of these sentiments are more prevalent among young people. And of course, part of the reason for that in some cases is that young people are themselves more ethnically diverse. So I think that what that suggests is that, again, with generational change and replacement always being a way in which we create societal change, that you would expect to see these sentiments become more prevalent in the population as a whole as generational replacement unfolds.
Thanks very much. I'll turn it back over to Eric.
Great. So I have an audience question for Sarah Binder, which is, regardless of which party controls the Senate after the Georgia elections, can a group of so-called deal makers, centrists like Joe Manchin, Susan Collins, Lisa Murkowski, exert real influence to create compromises on salient issues? Are there any examples of bipartisan groups like this exerting influence in previous post-war Congresses?
Great question. And I think there's always a temptation to want to believe that these gangs can form and be influential in the Senate. And I think we certainly have some examples. There are fewer and farther in between. And I'll come to one of them that stands out in a moment so we can think about why that might be important. But the reason I say that we want to believe that the Senate is a place still where individual senators can work outside the dictates of party leaders in a less centralized institution to bring measures, hammer out measures, bring them hopefully to the floor, and given the rules of the Senate, have a better prospects of meeting a supermajority. It makes sense conceptually that these bipartisan groups might make a difference. But the challenge in today's Senate is that the Senate has become remarkably centralized in an institution that doesn't have very strong rules to empower a majority like we see in the House. But how is someone like Mitch McConnell able to exert what seems to be an iron fist control of the chamber agenda? Well, he can do it to the extent that his Republican conference stands behind him and supports him and doesn't put pressure on him to loosen up the reins. And so we can see the prospects, the potential for a bipartisan group to form and to think through issues. There's one going on right now about COVID relief or COVID stimulus. And it seems that McConnell might have loosened the grips, but it's also because he's probably hearing from hardcore red state senators, some of them, that their states are hurting too. So it's hard to know. Is it the gang here that is loosening up the situation here, or is the gang reflecting broader concern in the Senate on both sides of the aisle that it's time for Congress to actually act? So there is potential here, but I don't think we should overstate their influence. Have there been ones in the past? The most recent one that had some semi-success was over immigration reform. And let's just say one quick thing about it. It was 2013, it was a Democratic Senate, Republican House, Democratic president, and it was 4 Republicans, 4 Democrats, and they closed the doors for months on end to hammer out a deal. They didn't divide the pie, they didn't split the difference. They put this sort of win-win. Your party Democrats got path to citizenship. Republicans got, at the time, what was an unheard of amount of border security money. Agriculture interests got a guest worker proposal. It stuck together, that group. They made a commitment. It stuck together in committee. It was not challenged on the floor to any success. And it passes with almost 70 votes, which is unheard of in today's Senate. And then of course it got killed in the House. So there are limits here, potential here, but ultimately some limits to making that type of progress.
Great. And I'll turn it back to Wendy.
Thank you. I have one last question, a quick question for each of the panelists, but before I get to that, and we'll finish on that question, I just want to thank the other contributors to the volume, Matt Glassman, Francis Lee, Nola McCarty, Kristen Kanthek, Samara Clara, and Yotam Schmargard, Catherine Gell, and Michael Porter, Lee Drutman, William Galston, and Todd Lindberg. So we appreciate their contributions. They've got terrific essays in the chapter as well. So the last question, it's round robin for everybody on the panel. And it's a terrific question, which is, you know, given what you've all discussed today, what would be one step that you would recommend that Democrats, Republicans, Libertarians, Socialists, Independents could take individually moving forward to try to bridge this sort of communication gap between liberals and conservatives, Republicans and Democrats, and bridge the sort of accepting of Biden as president versus being disappointed Trump lost? What would you advise individuals to try to do that want to create some semblance of, as Jim Morone pointed out, a Tocquevillian community in 2021? So I'll start in order of the presentation. So Deb Schildkraut will go first.
All right. Well, you know, I think it's interesting. One theme from a lot of the responses to the questions is, well, it's possible, but I'm not really optimistic. And I think you're going to hear a lot of that when we go around right now, too. I mean, one thing that I just keep thinking about a lot these days, whether it's, you know, public opinion about whether Biden won the election or not, or how people are responding to the pandemic, is just the importance of elite leadership and messaging. And so on its face, it sounds really simple. If elites give the message that it's important to work together, I think people will be much more open to that possibility. But for all the reasons, particular, you know, what many people talked about today, their incentives are pushing leaders away from that. But you know, it's on paper, it's really simple. You need a leader to send that message, and I think a lot of people will follow.
Thank you, John Sides.
I agree with what Deb said. I would say, if I'm advising people who are just like trying to live their lives as citizens and not feel like they're being continually sucked into this vortex of partisan animosity, I think the best thing to do, frankly, is to pay less attention to politics, which sounds weird to say because you don't want to do that. But actually, what I think I mean by that is to pay less attention to certain aspects of national politics. And to try to find ways in which you can engage politically, you know, in your local community, which of course is what Tocqueville was impressed by when he, you know, came to the United States in the 19th century. It was this little local kind of civic activism and civic engagement that he thought was notable. And my experience with that is that, of course, you can't take politics out of local issues any more than you can take it out of national issues. But a lot of local issues don't have to revolve around the same kinds of national framing and values and the like. So if we think about, you know, how do we improve local schools, or how do we develop neighborhoods in ways that are, you know, more sustainable? You know, there's a lot of things where I think, you know, some of the debates that we have in national politics really sort of fall to the background, and I think we can dialogue and engage with each other more fruitfully. And I think that has the benefit too of oftentimes bringing you into contact with people who are politically different from you, but in an arena that gives you more of an incentive to work together, rather than just falling back on, you know, the typical argument that you might expect between, you know, Democratic and Republican leaders who are called to like a split screen on CNN or whatever. So go local would be my advice.
Thank you. Sarah Binder?
So I used to think that the hokiest, silliest things people in Congress would do was to find a buddy on the State of the Union and have Republicans and Democrats pair off. And I just thought that was just the dumbest thing in the world. However, I have changed my mind. So they don't need to sit next to each other because that's not going to work. But finding ways for members from the opposite party, senators from the opposite party, to actually figure out who is on the other side of the aisle could pay some small dividends, because you can't construct deals where you give each party their most preferred outcome if you don't know what the other party wants. And so for whatever difference it might make, to have some greater ability, at least behind closed doors, to know the other side, I'm all in favor.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Sid Milkis?
Yeah, well, I've been warning against presidentialism, as Jim referred to it before, for longer than I care to admit, Wendy. So my advice would be we put less faith of our political faith in the presidency. It's really, it seems odd to me that a diverse population of 300 million people could put so much, invest so much political faith in one individual and call itself a republic. One point I want to add to Jim's is that we haven't just been lucky in avoiding presidential imperialism for much of our history. Unlike the Weimar Republic, which was a parliament, we have a separation and division of power. So I think John Side's point is quite well taken. Stop looking at the presidency and even at national politics. I think, boy, I've been thinking a lot about federalism lately, Wendy. Where would we be if we didn't have federalism in the midst of this coronavirus crisis, which the president didn't really want to tackle at the national level? And where would we be without federalism in this election crisis we now face? I have really been heartened by the Georgia Republicans' resistance to the Trump effort to deny, the first president in our history, to deny a peaceful transfer of power. The threat of authoritarianism is no longer theoretical, it's real. And I think federalism, and of course the courts as well, have been somewhat, their responses have been somewhat heartening to me.
Thank you so much. And to close it out, Jim Morone.
Yeah, let me say first, I take back everything that I've said bad about federalism and states' rights, Sid. You're absolutely right. But I want to end on a cheerful note from this election. The most striking, cheerful data to come out of this election is that millennials got involved, finally, in politics. By my lights, they have great values. They are far more likely to volunteer than previous generations. And now, finally, they've gotten into politics. And so my great advice has nothing to do with the presidency or with Congress, but has to do with millennials. Stay involved. You're the future. You have good values. If you stay involved, the republic will hold.
Let's listen to our children. Let's listen to our children.
Eric Patashnik, you want to just say a few closing words and then we will sign off.
Well, I just want to thank all the participants. I want to thank Wendy. It's been great working on this project with you. I really appreciate everyone's time. And I certainly know that I learned a lot from collaborating with all of you about many areas of American politics that I don't study. It's a incredibly exciting and important time to think deeply about the challenges we face. And I welcome and appreciate all the members of the audience who participated today. So thank you.
Thank you.